We're good.
Ah.
We are good. Okay, brilliant. So I guess perhaps we can get started here.
Hmm.
And I'm just going to introduce our speaker. First of all, I'd like to welcome everyone to Bodies and Being, our monthly speaker series, which is loads of fun because we have people like Dylan Bailey with us to talk about all these different aspects of, you know, bodies being embodied, whatever, anything to do with the pre-modern body that we find fascinating, to come and speak with us. So we are a collective of scholars working in various different faculties, different universities, different continents, and we all come together just to celebrate everybody's research and hear from people, make connections. Everybody is welcome. We especially welcome people who are not academics, who are just very interested in these topics. We try to make them very accessible for everyone. So if you are here and you are not an academic, that is absolutely fine. We also welcome participation. So if you find our work interesting and you want to contribute to the blog, you want to speak at our monthly series, or you just want to hang out at our monthly colloquiums where we literally just kind of sit around and gab, talk about our work and kind of how things are going, please feel free to do so. And you can find on our website, bodiesandbeing.com, a whole bunch of information about how you can get involved there. So I'd like to introduce Dylan Bailey. Dylan Bailey read history at the undergraduate level at the University of East Anglia, then carried out a taught master's degree in ancient cultures at the University of Glasgow. At Glasgow, he developed an interest in the literary depictions of and social attitudes toward liminal, marginalized groups in the medieval textual sources, especially those originating from Ireland. Dylan is currently conducting a Research Ireland-funded PhD thesis on the depictions of physical disabilities and impairments within medieval Irish learned literature as part of the Language, Education, and Medical Learning in the Pre-Modern Gaelic World, LIAS project, based in Maynooth University. So welcome, Dylan. I'm going to go ahead and let you take it away.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thanks to all of you for coming. I would like to start by expressing my gratitude to the Pre-Modern Body Project for having me here today, especially Autumn Reinhard Simpson, who first asked me to come and speak to you all. It's much appreciated. So today, excellent working. So today I thought I would provide an overview of some of the key ideas I've explored so far in my PhD thesis, which I'm getting near to the end of now. The project forms a part of the Research Island funded education, the Research Island funded Language, Education and Medical Learning in the Pre-Modern Gaelic World, or LIAS project, as mentioned in the introduction, led by my supervisor, Deborah Hayden at Maynooth University. In my work, I have explored in detail some of the many portrayals of physical disabilities and impairment found in medieval Irish learned literature. This PhD aims to be the first in-depth study of the depiction of both disability and impairment in the surviving early Irish material. I hope that this research will help to place the disabled community back into the historical discussion and to demystify the subject in an Irish context. So, to start off, it would probably be good to explain some of the terminology used in my thesis, as well as some of the unique challenges concerning studies of the medieval material which originates in Ireland. First of all, by Irish sources, I'm referring to any material with a likely Irish provenance. This can include texts which were composed or commissioned by Irish people and or those composed upon the island of Ireland. Some might argue that my work should use the term Gaelic to highlight the connections between Ireland and parts of the wider Gaelic world, like Scotland. However, most of the texts examined in this thesis have a clear Irish provenance, so I plan to use Irish whilst acknowledging and respecting that others might use the term Gaelic. I will also be bringing in texts from other cultural contexts where it might enhance our understanding of the Irish material. These matters of provenance will be especially important to keep in mind due to some of the specific issues that come with trying to date certain medieval Irish sources. Numerous medieval Irish manuscripts are now lost, sometimes destroyed in foreign invasions or ruined by the challenges of the Irish weather, amongst other factors. To illustrate this, It is worth noting that only three extant Irish manuscripts date to earlier than 1200. This means that many early Irish texts survive within manuscripts which date to the later part of the medieval period, even if there is strong evidence that such texts were first written down much earlier. For example, most extant early Irish law texts were first written down between the 7th and 9th centuries, but only survive in manuscripts from between the 14th and the 16th centuries. In fact, many of our early Irish texts, such as the Annals here, were extensively rewritten and contain radical alterations from later scribes. This sometimes makes it difficult to determine which parts of a text come from an earlier version or from the edits and additions of later compilers and copyists. These challenges with using the medieval Irish written material are a key reason why I've decided to focus on depiction in this thesis. Any attempt to work out whether such portrayals might represent the reality for people in medieval Ireland, while a valid area of inquiry and one I wish to consider in passing during my own research, is too big a question to be answered within this current research project. Such challenges also mean I must stress that any arguments made in my work are made insofar as the extant evidence is concerned. My assessments cannot be taken as generalizations based on the whole of medieval Irish learned literature. Instead, they can perhaps provide a glimpse into some of the depictions which can be found within the surviving material. Just a final point in terms of regarding terms and definitions. This thesis focuses on three broad categories of what I am calling learned literature. This includes the historical sources, such as the Annals, law texts and medical literature, the saints' lives and related hagiographical material, and the sagas. These three categories, in my view, are not only some of the more easily accessible sources for medieval Irish depictions of disability and impairment, but also provide some of the most insightful examples. It should be noted, though, that the medieval Irish understanding of text and genre was radically different to our own. The division between narrative texts like the saints' lives and sagas and the more practical sources, so-called, such as the annals and legal material, is now considered somewhat ahistorical. However, I would still argue that separating the sources can be appropriate if qualified with the right caveats. So, now that those definitions have been set out, I would like to explain some of the theoretical frameworks which lie behind this research. I will provide a summary of the most common approaches found within modern disability studies, before then moving on to discuss to what extent these approaches have been used within medieval studies. I will then touch on whether any previous research on the Irish material has engaged with this scholarship. I plan to finish this paper by providing a few case studies from my own thesis, which I would argue prove that the frameworks established by earlier scholars in both disability and medieval studies can be applied to at least some of the surviving sources from medieval Ireland. To start with, we should discuss the current state of play in modern disability studies. The majority of disability scholars and representative organisations currently base their approach on what is known as the social model. This model, which has its roots in the American civil rights movement of the 1960s, makes a distinction between an impairment, a usually permanent intellectual, physical, sensory, or somatic condition normally associated with pain, and a disability, a physical or socioeconomic barrier placed upon those with impairments, which limits one's day-to-day activities and ability to engage with the wider community. It argues that disabled people should be considered an oppressed group, and that disability should be viewed as a social oppression that needs to be removed from the lives of people with impairments. Crudely speaking, if you were to lose the physical ability to walk, you would have an impairment. But if you were to then face any sort of discrimination or prejudice as the result of said impairment, for example, not being able to access certain buildings or being called horrible names, you would then be disabled. This approach was adopted by most academics and activist groups by the 1990s. Now, there have been some criticisms of this approach. Some early iterations failed to fully account for independent cultural attitudes towards impairment. Disability scholar Tom Shakespeare, for example, has argued that discrimination does not always result from material circumstances, and the social model needs to be reconceptualized in order to include broader societal prejudices. Shakespeare has also argued that what he refers to as the strong social model fails to address the real physiological issues that people with impairments experience regardless of socioeconomic barriers. Indeed, it has been suggested by some that terms like impairment arguably will always have a cultural dimension, and the separation of disability and impairment does not always tell the whole story. Unfortunately, these oversights from the strong social model have made it less helpful as an approach for some members of the disabled community. Now, it should also be noted that these criticisms from Shakespeare and others have in turn been strongly challenged within disability studies. I personally think there is validity to the views of Shakespeare et al., but they should not lead to a complete rejection of the social model. This seems to be the view of many who are working in disability studies today. Indeed, despite their criticisms of the strong social model, Tom Shakespeare and others have stated that it is very possible to adapt the social model whilst avoiding problematic rhetoric about the disabled community. In fact, Shakespeare thinks that separating disability from impairment can be a useful and necessary tool for analysing both different cultures and historical time periods. This is where I stand on this matter. Some distinction between the concepts of disability and impairment can still be useful for discussing matters relating to the past. However, one must remember that these two concepts will not always be mutually exclusive, and the line between the two cannot and will not always clearly be defined. This is the position that I and many others in medieval studies have largely adopted within our own research. It should be stressed that the two concepts of disability and impairment, as we understand them now, did not exist in the medieval period. In fact, the English term disability does not appear until the 16th century. While there were many labels for individual impairments, no single all-encompassing term appears to have existed for disability, in either Latin or in the early forms of the Irish language. For example, the Irish term demurred has been translated as disability, whilst lanyard has sometimes been translated as impairment. But the exact connotations of these terms are not always clear, and they cannot be treated as one-to-one equivalents with our modern categorizations. Some medievalists have previously expressed skepticism about using modern terminology and analogies in studies of the medieval material. Irina Metzler, for example, expresses caution about using the term disability in what ethnologists call an etic way, using an idea from outside the society being studied and treating it as a universal concept. However, Metzler does argue that it could be acceptable to use impairment in this way, provided that disability is approached in an emic fashion, analysing a concept from within the society being studied and treating it as culturally subjective. Indeed, Metzler even argues that a separation between the two concepts is essential for avoiding inaccurate assumptions about medieval culture. I think it can be argued that the separate concepts of disability and impairment certainly existed to some extent during this period, even if there was no direct, even if there were, sorry, no direct translations for either of these exact terms, and the concepts themselves, of course, varied in their meaning over time. This can be seen with the early Irish lexicon. Demurred refers to defeat, disgrace, misfortune, and more generally to a lack of privilege, whilst lanyard appears to more often refer to injury, harm, or hindrance. Some of the words suggest a link between the social side of disability and physical impairment. Turburd, which more generally means crushing or destroying, can also have a legal application which refers to a married woman disabled by illness. That this term exists in legal context suggests that the two concepts of disability and impairment did to some extent exist in the language of medieval Ireland, even if there were no one-to-one equivalents for either term. This is an approach which has been used in other studies of medieval society, such as in discussions of the medieval evidence for religious disbelief and the evidence for racism. Now, Metzler's methodology has greatly influenced much of the recent research on disability and impairment within medieval studies. However, similar to the revisions within disability studies we have already discussed, the social model as defined by Metzler has also experienced some recent challenges. The most significant adjustment has focused on challenging the line between disability and impairment. This approach is generally referred to in medieval studies as the cultural or socio-cultural model, and is in many ways a direct response to Metzler's work. Joshua Euler, for example, argues that there are cultural and physiological factors in the disabled experience that the social model separation between disability and impairment fails to account for. This is also the view of Bianca Frone, who argues that the body itself should be considered a social construct when discussing disability in medieval times. Now, Metzler seems to largely agree with this viewpoint and has argued that the cultural model represents more of a refinement than a rejection of the social model. What's interesting here is that a similar evolution seems to have taken place within both disability and medieval studies. In both disciplines, scholars seem to have argued that that independent cultural and physiological factors need to be included in subsequent revisions of the social model, even if the fundamental divide between disability and impairment can still be useful for their research purposes. I personally find Metzler's approach very helpful. It draws heavily from current disability studies theory and allows for a distinction, but not a totally binary one, to be made between disability and impairment. This means that one will not automatically be assuming that people with impairments were treated as disabled in all places and all times, an approach which I think is essential for any historical study of disability. However, there will also be a degree of common, if not immutable, vocabulary, which scholars can then use to communicate these ideas across various historical contexts. Medieval studies is a multifaceted and diverse field, and I think it's important that, especially when discussing texts from different cultural contexts, there are some terms scholars can use to help broadcast their research to the wider community. I hope to be able to carry this out in my presentation today, and also, of course, within my wider research. Now, it should be said before moving on that a few scholars have previously discussed disability studies in a medieval Irish context, but these tend to be fleeting references to the material in wider studies, focused articles, or larger works, which tend to only consider specific types of impairment. They also, tend to more often be included as part of a wider comparative work. Indeed, very few of these investigations of the Irish material have engaged with the theory which has been formulated within the wider field of medieval studies, which was discussed earlier. But in terms of what we do have, Matthew Boyd recently published an article which explicitly considers how to use Metzler's model in relation to medieval Irish literature, in which he examines various examples from the law texts, saints' lives, and sagas. Boyd finds the distinction between disability and impairment useful, even if he argues, not uncontroversially, that some of Metzler's paradigms are overly Christian and therefore cannot be directly applied to some of the Irish material, which he considers to be pre-Christian or secular. Now, whatever people think of the Christian or pagan influence found in the medieval Irish sagas, and this is not a debate I'd like to get into right now, for our purposes, Boyd makes clear that Metzler's work is still applicable to the medieval Irish material, finding examples within what he refers to as the more secular material which he examines, that is, the medieval Irish saga texts. So, to summarize what I've talked about so far, there are some cases where scholars have examined disability and impairment in the medieval Irish material. However, there is still much more work that needs to be done in this area, and I am hoping that my thesis will be the first in-depth study of these concepts as found in the medieval Irish written sources. For the rest of this paper, I will discuss some of the case studies I've made use of in my PhD thesis and explain how I think they demonstrate that the theories behind disability and impairment, as articulated in previous disability and medieval studies scholarship, can sometimes be applied to the medieval Irish material. For my first example, we shall be looking at a case study from the medieval Irish legal texts. We have available a small corpus of surviving Old Irish medico-legal tracts, which are thought to have been composed around the last quarter of the 7th century. Two of these texts, Bretha Déan Ket and Bretha Crolaga, deal specifically with the compensation due to the physician for treating various types of injury and have parallels in other insular stroke continental material. For some more information about this, see, for example, Lissy Oliver's book, The Body Legal in Barbarian Law. So, the Old Irish stroke late Middle Irish Die Urkib Fola contains similar features to Bretha Déan Ket, such as considering the various levels of compensation legally owed for different types of physical injury. One section on the screen considers the importance of limbs in the context of other bodily impairments. Here following are the body fines for injuries. i.e. 4 shade for the lump blow, 3 read 2 shade for the white blow. Half of the full body fine for the deadly bed wound, that is without the loss of a limb. And if there is the loss of a limb, full honour price is paid for it. This text suggests that a limb impairment was considered one of the more serious types of physical injury. It is specified that if a limb is lost, the full honour price should be paid. This makes sense when one considers the importance of limbs for daily functioning within many human societies. Receiving a lump blow, that is, a blow which led to bruises and abrasions, or a white blow, a blow which left no mark, would be painful and unpleasant, certainly, but it would not necessarily affect one's day-to-day ability to hold tools or weapons. This would be especially this would be an especially relevant example, an especially important consideration in a rural society like medieval Ireland. Such a utilitarian approach towards physical impairment can be seen further in the specific limb injury hierarchy described in another section of Die Urquhart Folle. And half a scruple, 1.5 pennies, is paid by her to a fellow foreigner, and retaliation takes away a third from it, so that payment is a wether lamb for a little finger, i.e., which is worth a penny. It is in this case that there is the scruple, i.e. a sow for the chief finger of a hand, i.e. which is worth a scruple, a sow of 3 letters for the nub of a thumb, i.e. which is worth 2 scruples. Note the correlation here between the level of compensation and the hindrance a specific injury could result in. A wether lamb for a little finger, a sow for a middle finger, and a sow of 3 letters for the knob of a thumb. This compensation hierarchy can be found in some other early Irish law texts. Initially, I thought this made sense. Losing a little finger would, of course, be bad, but one could still probably hold a farm tool or wield a sword with the rest of the hand. Losing a middle finger would make these sorts of activities harder, and if one loses any part of a thumb, then one's ability to use that entire hand would be seriously affected. This is what I assumed, but then I discovered that in some places in Europe, there were differing ideas about this. Lissy Oliver, mentioned earlier, for example, has argued that while in early Germanic law texts, the most important unit on the hand is certainly still the thumb, the little finger should be considered more vital than the middle finger, which had far less practical significance for the ability to use the whole hand. Although I would say that the fundamental point about functionality remains intact here, the status of the middle finger now seems less certain in these texts. It is clearly not a universal rule that the middle finger should be considered more important than the little finger, and this might indicate something different in Irish approaches towards impairment compared to those of some other parts of Europe. I am still looking into this, and I am currently in communication with a few colleagues of mine about the matter. I would, of course, also really like to hear from any in the audience today who might have some insight into why this difference might exist. Any contributions would be greatly appreciated. But yeah, anyway, as also seen in the discussion about lump blows and white blows, Die Urquhart Folle seems to be considering both the physical toll of an injury, the impairment, whilst also considering the ability of the individual with said impairment to carry out certain daily tasks. One could argue that this depiction is acknowledging the difference between a disability, the ability to engage with certain tasks, and an impairment, the physical injury itself. This suggests that the medieval Irish legal material had some tacit understanding about the difference between a disability and an impairment, in line with the social model of disability. They might not have used these specific terms, but the idea is still there, right? So, my next case study will be a few extracts from the hagiographical material concerning St. Bridget, one of the patron saints of Ireland. In most of Bridget's extant saints' lives, the saint removes her eye to avoid marriage. For example, in the 9th century Bethu Brigta, Bridget's brother Becan claims that her eye and whole body will be the possession of a husband. In response, the saint immediately thrusts her finger into her eye and destroys it. Bridget then remarks that she doubts that anyone will ask her brother for a blind girl. The Middle Irish Life of St. Bridget records a similar story. Quote, Bridget put her finger under her eye and drew it out of her head until it was on her cheek, and she said, Lo, here for thee is thy delightful eye, O Becan. End quote. Only when Bridget's family allows her to remain unmarried and dedicate herself to God does the saint replace the eye. This story appears to be expressing some legal realities for women in medieval Ireland. There is some evidence from the medieval Irish law tracts that a person's physical or mental health could affect their marital status. One writes that a marriage could be ended if either partner became permanently ill. If a husband or wife went insane, the other was entitled to a separation. Indeed, it was even forbidden for a child to be reared by a mother who was, amongst other things, deaf, leprous, maimed in one hand, and, most relevant for this section of this paper, blind. The situation seems to have been similar in other parts of Europe. The onset of blindness in an intended bride could break off an engagement in Lombard law. In Welsh law, a facial blemish could lead to disinheritance. So I think the theories of Metzler et al. Can be applied fairly easily to this example, right? Bridget is threatened with marriage. Bridget then removes her eye, giving herself an impairment. Apart from the obvious pain this would cause, there is nothing here that would inherently render her ineligible to get married. Bridget and the author of the text are relying solely on legal discrimination and social stigma to prevent her betrothal during the narrative. This only works if there was already some accepted discrimination or taboo, a disability, against people with ocular impairments being married within medieval Irish society, either at the time Bridget lived as depicted in the text or during the period in which these texts were first written down. Regardless of the historical context, which this portrayal of disability may or may not reflect, I think this little vignette is certainly a pretty clear example of medieval Irish learned literature acknowledging the distinction between a social/legal disability and a physical impairment. So, for our final case study today, I will be examining an example from the medieval Irish sagas. I found multiple instances across several different types of medieval Irish learned literature of kings being at least threatened with removal from the throne for acquiring a physical impairment, not unlike the sort of injury acquired by my fellow Englishman, Harold Godwinson, over here. One notable example of this in the medieval Irish material would be the case of Nuada, king of the Tuatha De Danann, who appears in the 11th or 12th century tale Cath Moya Tuath, the Second Battle of Mag Tuath. At the start of this story, Nuada loses his arm in battle and then abdicates from the throne. Cath Moya Tuath writes that, quote, there was contention regarding the sovereignty of the men of Ireland between the Tuatha Dé and their wives, since Nuada was not eligible for kingship after his hand had been cut off, end quote. So here is another clear example of an impairment becoming a disability in medieval Irish literature. Nuada loses his hand and so gains an impairment. So far makes sense. Again, the pain itself notwithstanding, there's nothing inherent here about the injury which should prevent someone like Nuada from remaining king. Nuada only becomes disabled through the norms of the society in which he resides, in this case, the taboo against kings having physical impairments. Nuada eventually returns to the kingship once his arm is restored by Miach, son of the famous physician Jean Ket, and after his royal successor Bresh's cruel and unjust character is revealed. Now, it must be said that there is some evidence of exceptions to the stigma against regal impairments. For example, it is implied in the text that Bresh's poor rule was at least part of the motivation for bringing Nuada back. And such exceptions have been explored in more detail within my PhD thesis. You'll have to come back when it's finished to see what they are. Or, for now, you can check out this recent article I wrote for the Proceedings of the Harvard Celtic Colloquium, where I also address some of these points. Anyway, cheeky plug out the way there. For now, I will only say that Cath Moya Tuath is another example where we can arguably find a depiction of legal discrimination and social stigma, a disability, against people with physical impairments in the learned literature of medieval Ireland. This, once again, demonstrates the distinction between a disability and an impairment in the surviving medieval Irish corpus, per the theories of disability studies as articulated in a wider medieval context by Irina Metzler and others. So, to conclude, I feel inclined to argue, although terms like disability and impairment should be used with caution, that they still clearly can be used to discuss some examples from the medieval Irish learned literature, in line with the theories put forward in the wider fields of both disability and medieval studies. I hope I have managed to convey this argument well enough to you all here today. If you have any comments and or questions about anything in this presentation or about my wider research, I am more than happy to take them now or after this session. You now have my email and I'm on the web. So please, if you have any other points of information or if you have inquiries, do get in touch. Thanks a lot.
I'll say Autumn, you're on mute, but yes, thank you very much, Jill. That was
Sorry.
amazing. I could see Autumn praising you in silence, but yeah, that was so interesting.
Goodness.
That was so fascinating. That was wonderful. I really, really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. And I have questions, but I do want to open it up to other people first. So, I thought I saw... Annika, did you have your hand up or were you just clapping? I don't know what that means, the little...
I was clapping, but I actually do have a question. So first of all, I really enjoyed your presentation. I thought it was really, really well done and well structured and fascinating, even though it's not like my field at all. So I was wondering whether you could go... So I think you really made a case for sort of applying disability history to the Irish medieval case. So if you turn it around and then have to sort of consider the question, what does the Irish case add to disability history? What would your answer be? So like, how does it maybe shift our understanding of medieval disability? Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's one of the reasons I'm so interested in this because I think I think history and the study of the past in general is it's bettered if we look at various texts from various cultural contexts, either different time periods or different different sort of geographical or cultural regions, whatever you want to say. So yeah, I think that this study definitely has the potential to do that. I think off the top of my head, I think one of the key elements that, at least in this presentation, that I think would maybe be demonstrative of that would be the example of the fingers that I mentioned, actually. The fact that, at least based on my research so far, and we'll see where this goes, and I am in conversation with some people about this, but there seems to be a suggestion that the Irish had a slightly different attitude towards, the sort of the hierarchy of the fingers compared to some other parts of Europe, which might suggest, and I feel like this illustrates above all else why we have to take this kind of, even if it's not a completely binary thing, the idea of the separation between disability and impairment is so important because of how culturally subjective these things are. I hope that answers your question somewhat.
Yeah. And I'm sure you are familiar with it, but like this is I was at the University of Bremen, and my colleagues there in the medieval department had this Homo debilis project going on, and I think most of the output was in German, but I looked it up and I do have like some publications in English as well that might be of interest to you. But I mean, you do seem to be like very broadly informed about the field. So this is just a suggestion to maybe like look this up as well, because I do think it's very it's a fascinating approach. And yeah, so it was basically also concerned with like disability history in medieval times.
Thank you. I don't actually think I'm aware of that project, so thank you so much for letting me know. I will be looking that up. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Any other questions for Dylan other than mine?
Oh, you go ahead, Autumn. I'll ask after you.
I have like 400, so I'll do one, and then you can do one, and then Dylan, if you don't mind sticking around after we're done recording and whatever, we'll chat some more.
Sure. Yeah, by all means.
So I'm really struck by your story about Bridget and her eye. And first of all, I love that you point out that that it's more of a social disability in a sense. And I know I'm going to get all these terminology and everything wrong because this is a very new field for me. But what really struck me as someone who does a lot of work on religious history in England, and especially women's bodies, is how representative that was to me anyway. And I'm curious what your thoughts are of her having effectively impaired or disabled the body of her future husband by doing it to herself, because her brother does say this body is actually your future husband's, it belongs to him, and she's like, cool, making it useless now. And then when she becomes effectively a bride of Christ, that husband restores it. And I found that so interesting, and I have no idea where my brain is going with that, but I'm just curious if that's something you had thought about, or if it is just a complete fabrication on my own part.
Not at all. That is an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that actually, but that is yeah, a good point. I mean, the story itself, I didn't have time to get into it there, but the story itself, most likely is evoking imagery from sort of biblical and previous saints' lives. Like there's the example of Saint Lucy, who does a similar thing. In that case, there's a suitor, and she takes out her eye and offers it to him in order to kind of tell him to go away, basically. So there is. So I think that's important to keep in mind with this. But yeah, I think there's definitely this idea of that, like, there is definitely this idea that like basically having to choose between two men in a sense. Like you could definitely put it that way. And yes, I mean the point of the story, the sort of the narrative prothesis, which she sort of which the impairment is sort of acting as there. That's sort of one term for it. Is there in order to convey that she's dedicating herself to God, and that actually that's her like primary aim in her life. So yeah, there's certainly something I didn't get into in here, but something that's probably important, certainly not unique to Ireland in this regard, but most of these texts will have been composed by guys in monasteries. So I think regardless, and look, Bridget has had a lot of reinventions over the years and attempts to take, and those are fine, like making her more of like a feminist character and stuff, and that's awesome. I don't have a problem with that, but with these original texts, you do have to think that there's always going to be, I think, a bit of a patriarchal element to them, however you look at it. So that's definitely, I really like that point, though. I'll make a note of that.
I agree, and I think maybe more what I was saying is it sort of upholds a patriarchal point in the sense of she's disfiguring his body through her. But I don't know. I'm making all this up. But the next question I have is sort of related, because I was teaching medieval history. And of course, I am more conversant with England. So of course, I was doing the whole kind of cramming to teach, early medieval French history at one point. And something that struck me was you're talking about the king and missing a hand. And forgive me, I don't remember if it's the Merovingians or the Carolingians, but one of them had, I'm pretty sure it was the Merovingians, this idea that if you cut a man's hair off, he cannot rule in any capacity. And that was kind of what they did to sort of show authority and legitimacy. And I just wondered if you came across any of that. And, obviously losing your hair is not going to impair you.
Yes.
But clearly a social impairment. And so I found that really fascinating in light of what you were talking about. And I just didn't know if the two had a connection, or if I was making things up again.
No, I think there is a connection there. In fact, there was a point in one of the chapters on my thesis where I was talking about that there's a there's a couple of saints' lives, and I'm struggling to remember the name. I don't want to give the wrong one, but where there's a few where people who have done bad things are rendered, are given impairments, and one of the elements that they seem to like to highlight is actually losing the hair. And and losing hair has a huge. Well, it's interesting. It's kind of one of those weird things where it's like on one side it's associated with shame and dishonor. It's also associated with being put in monasteries and with monks, right, and tonsuring their hair. Now, those things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. And in the case of the Carolingians and Merovingians, I haven't looked at that period for a while, but I believe the idea was, a king couldn't be in a monastery, right? So like there was that kind of separation between those two roles. So I do think there's. So I do think there's an element there of that, not my field of expertise, but yes, hair. And I mean, ultimately, what I found in a lot of these cases, which again, I think is one of these interesting things, I talked a lot about functionality in, especially in the case with the law text, and that is an element that is there. However, in a lot of cases, even in the law text, you realize, like, logically, like in some cases, the fines, and Lissy Oliver also talks about this, so this isn't unique to Ireland either, but like in a lot of cases, the fines for certain injuries which like are higher, which don't affect the actual day-to-day functioning or don't affect the actual like ability to go away, but there is a focus on the visual aspect. So there is this element of social stigma, which is still actually playing a really big role, even if the practical element is also there, if that makes sense.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much. I feel like I have
Thank
learned
you.
semesters worth of fascinating stuff about an area and a geographic area and an academic area about which I know almost nothing. So this was wonderful. Anybody else have any other questions? I think Francesca, you did.
Oh yeah, of course. I've got to bring something Old Norse into this. Yeah,
Excellent, bring it.
I really enjoyed this talk mainly because I'd like because I've recently submitted, my like thesis draft to my supervisors and they went, "Oh, have you considered bringing disability studies into this?" At which
Oh,
point I
very
was
good.
then reading all of this stuff and I think it's not something that I'd looked into before at all. So obviously going from like Metzler to, some of the other scholars that you mentioned there, and reading all of that. And I'm kind of glad to have had the talk today because I was like, yes, actually, I feel like I understand this a lot better now, especially like a difference between, impairment and disability by like the social lens.
Brilliant.
Because I mean, I thought, well, may as well ask your opinion on this situation that in a lot of Old Norse sagas, in like the legendary
Mm,
sagas, you get a repeated situation in battle scenes where people get like a grievous facial injury, whether it's like
mm,
part of their jaw sort of chopped or like, kind of marked in what would be, very painful, disfiguring.
mm,
And when that happens in these battles, the people who it happens to turn into animals, whether it's like a boar or a dragon, or some sort of serpent. And so I was sort of considering, like, could you understand that as like the injury initially was, an impairment to them? It would have affected their vision, the pain obviously would affect their ability. But then obviously because it's
mm,
the legendary sagas, it's all very fantastical, people turn into animals.
mm,
Could that animal form be like symptomatic of a perception of disability in the sense that they become a creature rather than a human and sacrifice some of their identity and autonomy by turning into something that's inhuman? Um,
mm.
so yeah, I don't know where I was really going with it, and I've not made it a massive part of like my analysis in those sections, but I thought, well, I may as well ask someone that clearly knows a lot more about disability studies than I do.
Well, I'd be very interested to read that as and when that's ready for consumption by the public. So I'm looking forward to that. What is interesting? I was just racking my brains trying to think, and I can't say this for certain, but I can't think of actually too many examples of that happening in the Irish material, which is kind of interesting with it's like turning into animals. I say that there are examples of there are examples I can think of where in the Irish sagas where sort of forms of impairment, or well, and this is something I didn't get into, but there is also like I sometimes make use of the term exceptionality rather than impairment because there are some cases where there are mythological beings who might have certain physical attributes which are unusual to humans, but they're not really impairments because they're not injuries or that like I mean so I do sometimes look at that. And there is the example of I don't know how much you're aware of the sort of the Irish character Cuchulainn, who is sort of a big character for those who don't know. Sort of he's kind of like I think he's been referred to in some cases kind of like the Irish Achilles or sort of like a Hercules kind of figure, and there are examples in the texts where he experiences a form of eye impairment where he has what's known as I think it's a rishtad, or I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly. I didn't practice that before I came here, but it's a warp spasm where basically one eye gets really small and another guy gets very big, and he sort of contorts himself. It's going into a kind of a battle frenzy, like what you see also in Norse texts. I'm mentioning all of this because this sort of is an example of kind of what you were saying about people acquiring some sort of physical impairment and then it kind of almost spreading and kind of and sort of both the kind of the actions of the impairment but also the physical manifestation is sort of being linked there and it's being conveyed. I don't know if that kind of maybe that doesn't really answer the question you're asking, but that is a really interesting idea and stuff with the animals. I will think about that actually. So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, no, I feel like, you must like feel the same as well. As soon as anyone mentions anything in their research, they're like, yeah, actually that, could I ask about this?
Yeah,
It links so interestingly. But
absolutely.
yeah, the other thing I was like thinking, as you were sort of citing the different sources that you brought up, I was just wondering, obviously you mentioned like, I mean, to be fair, it's a kind of similar issue of chronology that I experienced with like the legendary sagas is the fact that like you're dealing with sources
Yes.
that probably originate somewhere between like fourth to ninth century, but don't actually survive in anything to like late medieval, even early modern manuscripts. Um,
Mm.
when it comes to like seeing whether there's different versions of the same text from different periods or from a different provenance, and especially the fact
Mm.
that like, I mean, I'm not entirely sure for Irish, but certainly the case for like a lot of Scandinavian and Icelandic texts is they only come obviously after literacy, which is predominantly through like the church. Do you
Mm.
find any variation of like the same sources in different manuscripts or of sort of like the same narratives in different settings or contexts, like dealing with disability in different ways and whether different kind of religious influences deal with disability or impairment in like different ways at all? Was there anything that stood out to you so far?
Yeah, I mean, it's something for the reasons I mentioned and for the reasons you alluded to with the dating, it is a hard thing to sort of get into. So it is, yeah, it is hard to kind of start discussing like, oh, here's this character in this text, and this is definitely before this text and this depiction. So it is something I've kind of touched at, but I haven't gone into too much detail about. But it is something I'd like to explore in the future. But there are definitely some examples like there's the so there's an example. I was talking about exceptionalities earlier, actually, and what's interesting there is so there's this character called Baelor who also appears in Cathmor Tureth, actually, the text that in my last example that I mentioned. And what's interesting there is he originally starts off in that text. He's sort of like a cyclops, basically. He's got like this enormous eye which has to be pulled open, and it's what I would call an exceptionality. What's interesting is that this motif of the one eye, it gets taken and it gets sort of used in later sagas which take inspiration from it. But what's interesting is by that point, and this is in the collection of stories known as the Finn Cycle, which I do a lot of work on. What's interesting there is at this point it has become an injury. Now the connotations are quite similar. There's a lot of associations with destruction and villainy. However, it's gone from sort of a cyclops to an actual physical injury that the guy got in battle. Now, I don't know what the significance of that necessarily is, but it is interesting how it has evolved over time, but kept the same connotations, which I think is definitely worth commenting on. So thank you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. That sounds so interesting. I suppose as well, like, I mean, you've got kind of in one case, like something that's kind of, more to the mythological side versus more to the like
Mm.
realism of like, Cyclopses,
Mm.
fantasy, but, eye injury
Yeah,
in
yeah.
battle, highly likely. But yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
thank you
that's
for
true,
that.
actually. Yeah, it's definitely that's definitely something to think about. Yeah.
Any other questions for Dylan? Fantastic. Dylan, that was amazing. Once again, I really, really
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it. Thank you so much for joining us. Um, and of course, if you loved this presentation so much, you can watch it again on our YouTube channel. So you can check it out there. Should be I'd say within a couple days or so. Um, and yeah, I really hope that we will see you around, whether it's at IMC, whether it's at here at Bodies and Being. Thank you once again, and thank you all for joining us.